Okay, hi everyone. So this video will cover more specifically parts of the text that we're beginning with on page 25 to 44. I'm calling this the first part of the dialogue because it mostly focuses on a conversation with Gorgias. And then I'm ending this first part on page 45 because that's where we switch over to Polus talking more. Now, remember that I said in the previous video that ancient Greek philosophy is very focused on determining what the nature of things are, right? So what's the nature of a piece of wood, or the nature of a book, the nature of a river, the nature of air and water, the nature of justice, right? The nature of truth, the nature of beauty. Ancient Greek philosophy, according to Plato and Socrates, is very much focused on trying to determine what is the essence of a thing that exists in the world. And that's why Socrates will keep saying to Gorgias, tell me what kind of thing in the world rhetoric is. What in the world is it? What is its nature? What is its essence? Now, Polus does talk a little bit here in the beginning. He says, Gorgias is tired of talking. I'll take over for him for a while. You can ask me your questions. But then Socrates gets frustrated with Polus because Polus doesn't do a very good job of answering the question, what is rhetoric? He starts saying whether rhetoric is good or bad. And Socrates is like, I didn't ask you about the quality of rhetoric. I'm asking you what it is. So he gets frustrated with him, and then Gorgias has to step in and take over for his student. So he's trying again to tell me, Gorgias, what is the nature of rhetoric? And eventually Gorgias's answer is that rhetoric is discourse. Okay, so that's the first step. What type of discourse is it? And eventually he comes up with something to the effect of discourse. It is the discourse that persuades. Okay, but then there's other types of discourses that persuade, right? The discourse of arithmetic or geometry, for example, persuade by teaching, 1 + 1 = 2. The discourse of calculation tells us how to add numbers together. The discourse of arithmetic tells us what numbers are. These are all didactic forms of persuasion, right? And the result of this didactic persuasion is knowledge, right? It teaches, this is line 453E, roughly, how the art of arithmetic and geometry, these types of arts are discourses that persuade people of knowledge, right? So then Socrates asks again, well, what art is it that persuasion, what type of persuasion is it? What kind of art is it that persuasion is about? And Gorgias answers, again, similar to Polus, he sidesteps the question. He says where persuasion is used. He says it's used in the courts, and it's used with mobs, by which he means like crowds of people. In other words, a mass audience, right? And again, does this answer Socrates' question? No, it totally sidesteps it. He still hasn't said what rhetoric is about exactly. And then finally, around line 454b, Gorgias finally says that it concerns things that are just and unjust. Okay? And then he explicitly makes the connection, a couple of lines earlier on line 452d, he explicitly makes the connection with politics and says that rhetoric is used to persuade people about political matters. Okay? So now he's sealed his fate, because those areas, Socrates will show, those are the domain of philosophy, which is the art of discerning the best things. Remember, he's using the word art here. Whenever you hear the word art in this dialogue, think things that concern the best things, the essence of things. So art in the sense of the fine arts. These are the finest and best of things. That's what an art is. And then later, at the end of the signed reading for today, on page 45, when we start the next section of the dialogue, people turn to Socrates and say, well, how do you define rhetoric? And Socrates says, it's not an art, but an experience. And then later he goes on to clarify, like it's a flattery. It's an experience of flattery, right? Look in the modules that I have written out, like a table where I've divided all the different words that are used for, so remember, sophistry, I forgot to put that one. I should put that there. Sophistry, rhetoric, demagoguery, propaganda, all of those words you can kind of think of as being sort of interchangeable. And we're contrasting those types of things with philosophy, which Socrates says is concerned about truth and the nature, the essence, discerning the essence of the world. That's what leads to knowledge versus believing. So you see there, eventually, Gorgias will have to admit that rhetoric doesn't lead to knowledge. It only leads to believing, the kind of knowledge that it's not knowledge, but it's believing without any knowledge. Okay? So the other thing I wanted to point out to you in this section is look at line 454C. This is not the main part of the argument, but this is just, I thought it was a good example of the dialectic, because this is where Plato says, we're going to do the conversation this way so that you may bring your own views to a conclusion in accord with what you yourself have already set down. That's a description of the dialectic. So he wants Gorgias to come to his own logical conclusion. Given what you say, if you state A is the case, then B has to follow from A. It has to build on it. This is how logic works, right? So he's explaining the dialectic in that line. He wants Gorgias to come to his own logical conclusion. And when you think about it, isn't that still the way we teach today? It should be. Like, this is how, this is why higher education is not actually indoctrination, like some populist demagogues like to claim. We teach you how to build a logical argument, and that is not indoctrination at all. That is the opposite of indoctrination. So just like Socrates does not give a lecture, these are always dialogues. He's not going to give a lecture and tell you this is that, this means this, that means that. That would just inspire belief. In other words, equate it with faith. It's like faith. It's part of, that would be like the mystery of faith is belief without knowing. That's why it's a mystery, right? That's a very, very different thing from knowledge and philosophy. And rhetoric or demagoguery works by building on faith. It doesn't show you a logical connection between ideas. You just take propaganda is you take on faith what the demagogue says is the truth. They don't lead you to the truth. They tell you this is what it is, and you agree with it. That leads to belief, Socrates says, but it does not lead to knowledge. And that's a very dangerous thing to build politics on, right? So you can see, obviously, like how incredibly influential the teachings of Socrates and Plato were for, not the history of political thought. This stuff is so much in our culture that we take it for granted. But at the same time, isn't it crazy? Like, we're living in this time today where these very, very, very fundamental ideas are being questioned. And that's why I designed this course, Democracy and Propaganda. Anyway, so not to get off too much on a tangent, they eventually go to a distinction between learning and believing. Like I said before, learning is gaining knowledge, and it's not the same thing as believing, which is without knowledge. They also determine that there's a difference between false beliefs and true beliefs. So that leads them to the conclusion that there are two forms of persuasion. In line 454E, they say there's belief without knowing, and then there's knowing true things. There's true knowledge. And Gorgias admits that rhetoric teaches belief without knowledge. He says rhetoric is a craftsman of belief inspiring, but not didactic persuasion about the just and unjust. So, Gorgias gives a long speech. When Socrates presses him to say, Gorgias gives what the power of rhetoric is. Gorgias gives a long speech describing the awe-inspiring power of rhetoric to persuade people, even though it doesn't have the knowledge that the doctor has, the knowledge of healing bodies that the doctor has. Rhetoric has the power to persuade people to either follow the doctor's orders or not follow the doctor's orders. So he says it's more powerful than the knowledge of the doctor, right? And Socrates, and another example of how Socrates is very gracious about his interactions with other people. Like, he's very polite, even though he gets accused of being rude, but he's actually very polite, because he says something to Gorgias like, well, I take it on faith. I trust that you yourself are, like me, primarily interested in pursuing the logical truth of the argument. So you should not get upset if I point out to you where you're wrong. And line 458a, he says it's better to be disabused of one's own false belief than to enlighten others. For, quote, it is a good to be released oneself from the greatest evil than to release another. For I think nothing is so great an evil for a human being as a false belief. So in other words, Socrates is saying, I'm not going to get offended if you prove me wrong or show me where the error of my logic is, and I trust that you won't get offended either, since you are a professional, right? And Gorgias says, sure, yes, I agree with that, but other people may be tired. And Cepharon and Callicles pop up and say, nope, not tired at all. We want to encourage you to keep going because we love this stuff. This is very fascinating. This is about line 458c. So Gorgias asks so Socrates asks if when Gorgias says that rhetoric persuades people in a mob, that amounts to essentially among those who don't know, right? Being in a mob, in a mass group of people, it's essentially you're talking about people who don't know, not the doctors themselves, but the crowd. For among those who know, he says, I don't suppose the rhetorician will be more persuasive than the doctor, right? And Gorgias agrees. This is line 459b. So then the rhetor doesn't need to have the knowledge of the doctor. They just need to appear to know more than the doctor when they are among people who don't know any better, right? So I've inserted that any better, but that makes it just a little bit more clear. So amongst those who don't know, you can appear to know more than the doctor if you are trained as a rhetorician, right? You see how this is the skill of the demagogue. Amongst people who don't know very much about international relations or political science, a demagogue can convince those people that they actually know about those things when they don't, right? So it's very dangerous. And so Socrates says, so it's the same for knowledge of justice and the good. The rhetorician doesn't know those things. The rhetorician is not a philosopher. They just appear to know those things. The people who really know those things are the philosophers, the people who have spent time, like Socrates has, in examining the true essence of concepts like what is the nature of truth? What is the nature of justice? What is the nature of beauty? That's the only way you can know what true justice and beauty and truth is by contemplating their true nature, and that is what philosophers do, right? So Socrates shows Gorgias how this contradicts Gorgias's own earlier statement, where he had said earlier that you can't blame the teacher for the student using what they're taught badly, right? So you can't blame the rhetorician for if the student uses their rhetorical skills for injustice. But now Gorgias, is also claiming that the rhetorician must be teaching knowledge of justice and injustice to the student, because he says, if the student doesn't know the difference between right or wrong, then I will teach them that too. Well, Socrates says you've just, made this logical inconsistency. It does not harmonize, he says on line 461a. So you see, this first section of the dialogue is just all about Socrates pressing Gorgias over and over again to state what is the nature, the essential nature of rhetoric, what is its topic. And when Gorgias finally states that its topic is the nature of truth and justice, in other words, it's the realm of politics, then that's where he's come to that an irrefutable logical inconsistency, right? And so that's the end of the first dialogue. So the next section on page 45, Polus is going to take over. And they ask, like I said, they ask Socrates, now you tell us then, what is your answer of rhetoric? And so Socrates will begin explaining what his idea, what the essence of rhetoric is in his own eyes. And that I'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide, okay? So hopefully those are the key parts that I want you to focus on. I have them listed here, you know, the connection between rhetoric and politics at line 452D, the distinction between learning and believing, and then Gorgias, where he says that the power of rhetoric resides in its ability to convince people to believe something. And then, but then Socrates points out that it only works for those who are ignorant. It doesn't work on those who know better. It only works for those who don't know any better, right? So those are key points. Like I said, you know, highlight certain areas on the text. I use different colors because there's different key themes that are being interwoven. So like I said, I have like the color orange for me. Anytime they talk about art or the essence of things, I have underlined it in that color. Anytime they talk about politics, when he starts to make that connection with politics, I underline that in blue. So my different colors represent different themes that are mentioned in different places, so that I can find those areas where they talk about that theme more quickly. And then I also write in the margin, you know, here's the speech where Gorgias is explaining about the power of rhetoric to influence people, because that is something that you might need to know. So totally mark up this book. Think of this textbook as a notebook. You got to mark it up, put all your notes there so you can find things, so you have the line numbers right there. You can go right to the text and cite evidence from the text whenever we meet back in person again and have our in-class assignments again. Okay, so I hope this is helpful. I will try to do it the next slide or else the next video on the next segment of the reading, which begins on page 45. Okay, all right, see y'all soon.